we've been building up things, and basically by Tuesday, we've got the core stuff that you definitely need to be aware of. And then after that, it's just sort of things on the edges which might be useful for you. So we've been gradually building up to things, so that yesterday we were looking at the expenditure and how to think about trying to constrain expenditure so it generally stabilizes. Today, though, we're looking at the one that some people like, some people hate, and some people know that it's good for us, despite it being painful. And so we're talking about taxation, basically. This lecture in the in-person course is actually 2 lectures. And even when it's 2, each one of the 2 is quite long, normally spill over 90 minutes for each bit. So it is a challenge to do this in the virtual environment. But anyway, we'll get there, but I will try and give us some breaks. Apologies to Incencio. I know he may not be here yet, but I didn't get a chance to properly line up the Portuguese with the French and the English. The French and the English are abridged versions. They are a mere 80 slides, not the 120, whatever it is, that the full lecture is. But they are abridged to a degree. So this lecture's, as it's titled in English, and if you want to see it in French or Portuguese, please select the other screen. Is about domestic revenue mobilization, which is a fancy way of saying having legitimized theft with menaces. At least that's what some people would say anyway. And that's what we're going to be walking through today. So these 2 parts, this reflects the fact that there are actually 2 lectures here. And the first lecture is focusing on the design of tax systems, and then some issues, policy issues and reforms to try and enhance the capacity to raise revenue. Part B has a variety of things in it. The first one is to do with mobilizing revenue in developing countries, how you can implement systems in developing countries. But then importantly, the second one on the performance of a system. This is looking at the efficiency of collection. And I'll talk a few things about that then. And then lastly, modernizing revenue administration. You can improve the collection capacity, you can improve the administration of it to reduce the actual cost of extracting funding from the public. And at the end of it, there's a case study on Mozambique. We will not really get time to do that today. But that's the outline of what we're going to be doing. Any questions on this? Please do not hesitate to ask questions. I know you can raise your hands, but you're better just to talk and shout out. And it's much better if you do that. So stepping into part A, which is on the general principles for designing a tax revenue system. This is if one was in a Python-esque environment, this would be, Ethel the Aardvark goes designing the tax system, for those who know that particular one. So the purpose of taxation. Basically, the government needs to get funding so it can spend it. And this has been around for an awful long time, revenue raising. It's been done in a variety of different ways with different types of incentives placed on people. You can read ancient texts about this. Revenue being raised in a variety of different ways. In its most basic, just even collecting harvest as a tax, 10%, tithing. I lived about, sort of been in miles, so 8 miles, so 12 kilometers or so from a tithe barn that was still in use. It had all sorts of little stone turrets for platforms so that grain could be stored in it from the local farmers to give as their tithing. That was originally for the church, but it eventually became used for revenue collection for the crown. That's in Britain. If we go back even further, you read about the various mechanisms to get revenue to fund not just religious but government entities, and often they were interlinked. And clearly when things are out of kilter, they get a bit aggressive about how they're going to extract funding. And originally, of course, the revenue was purely to fund military expeditions, and gradually over time that changed. And we know in Europe and near Asia, Asia Minor, an awful lot of roads and aqueducts were built, funded by taxes paid by people. You can see in the Roman Empire, when the emperors weren't actually paying much attention to things, the Senate would go and do things and insist that the emperor stamp them through. And most of those things that they got quite stroppy about were to do with raising tax. Now, these other points in here, this redistribution, special goals, externalities, economic regulation, these types of issues have become increasingly important in the last 150, 160 years. The primary aim of governments before that was for simply things like roads and armies rather than anything else. And taxes were generally a form of excise tax or on property, things that you couldn't easily avoid. And you got stupidities at times as a wealth type estimation by counting how many windows you'd have, and they would charge a tax on that. Hence, if you go to some countries in Western Europe, you can see old buildings where the windows have been blocked up so they have to pay the tax. And that's an avoidance measure. So this comes back to a thing that we're going to talk about a little time about fairness. So basically, most of these items on here are modernisms, which governments didn't get into. And some of the earliest type of redistribution forms of tax were for the innovations during the 19th century, where they started to put in place education programs. Surprisingly, some countries have been doing that for a long time, and it was done quite the way we do it now. But you could see in Parliament in Westminster an extra penny being put on the tax to fund education. And by the way, income taxes were non-existent really much before the end of the 18th century. Income tax, as sort of as we know it today, was an innovation to fund the Napoleonic Wars. as everything else has been funded by excises. Special goals, we'll be talking about those, and these externalities. Externalities are the things that are front of brain at the moment, right? COVID-19 is an externality, although it's now been internalized in more ways than one. The financial crisis is an externality, but these are things that are pretty much de rigueur nowadays. And then last but not least, economic regulation. So that's the purpose of taxation. But the primary one is that top one, just extracting money so you can do things. So on the Portuguese side, this is a non-compressed one. I will have to mix and match to keep it in track. So the key principles are these 5 ones here. Is it an efficient method of extracting revenue? Can it be easily avoided, or can it be undermined in some way? And the more easily it's avoided, the less efficient this is going to be. The second point is actually quite important, but often it's a tertiary thing that's considered, and that's on fairness and equity. You can see in many countries where 2 families have the same level of income, but one family pays half as much or double the tax of the other, purely because in one family they've got 1 income earner, and in the other family they've got 2 income earners, and because of that, one family with 1 income earner pays more tax than the other. That is clearly not fair and it's not equitable, but that's the way the system is designed. How flexible is it? In other words, can we easily make changes to adapt it for different contexts or situations? Is it administratively simple? Does it, for every $1 we get in revenue, well, we actually having to spend $2 to pay for the paperwork? That would clearly not be efficient. And if that amount of administration is required, there's an awful lot of administration. Therefore, it's not going to be simple. In the United States, when you have to fill in the tax forms, they are long. And there's a big industry in filling them in for people. And that's just the form. It's not the bureaucracy at the other end of it that processes it. And then transparency. Is it clear how that money is going to be deployed? Is it easy to see what the government's doing with that money and how they're actually collecting it and processing it? And if you've got a well-designed tax system, it's going to be highly efficient and not impact on the economy, and it's going to be efficiently run through the country. It is going to be equitable to everybody. It will be flexible so that it can be adapted easily and for any changes in situation. The administration on it will be very straightforward and very light-handed, and it will be very clear what, why, and when. So those are things that you need to keep in mind if you are administering a system. But unfortunately, from the perspective of an official, you've got to consider the political context in which your advice is going to be taken, and the political biases which are held by the decision makers. And given that this is all politics, there's nothing you can do about it. But the best, you need to be providing the very best advice that you possibly can, given the context. And if you're going to be reforming the system, what you need to be doing is constantly looking at each of these and thinking about how you can improve them. And if you've got a tax that's going to prevent the proper functioning of the economy, you know you've got a problem. That's this blue box here in the English and the French. It's not in the Portuguese. If you're doing things that prevent the economy from allocating resources efficiently, you've got a problem. And so I've just relined the Portuguese up to do this. So that's what the blue triangle area is the so-called deadweight loss. It is where there's some inefficiency that's going to impact the ability of the economy to actually do things optimally. And you should be trying to minimize what that area is. So economic efficiency and equity and fairness, these two parallel concepts. Now, remember we were talking about elasticity yesterday, and how if you put up the price, to put up the tax or the excise on something and demand doesn't move, that's the sort of good you want to be able to be taxing, all right? This is this Ramsey rule. So the more elastic, the less tax, because it's just not, the thing won't be working very well. But the less elastic, price is not going to move regardless. The demand for it's not going to move regardless. You put a lot of tax on it, and that is why you tend to find a lot of tax being put on things like cigarettes and alcohol. But there are reasons, as it says here, for deviating from that, in terms of the economic burden being excessively applied to groups that may not be well placed to pay it. And you do see that with cigarettes. You do see it with alcoholic beverages and other basic core things that people buy, such as milk. So you have to trade that off. I touched base upon the fairness and equity part of it. It can be very difficult to implement something that's perfectly equitable and fair, but the more the wedges between the two, so the more unfair it's perceived, you're actually going to generate avoidance, or indeed in the extreme evading type behaviors. There's a couple of these benefit and ability to pay principle. I mean, the ability to pay principle was one of the things that really impacts when you decide to put in a flat tax. It doesn't matter what your income is, what your situation is, you're going to pay $100 a year for this, and we don't care. And this is an example from the United Kingdom. Now, they 34 years ago started to implement a uniform council charge which was called a poll tax. That was not its actual name, but that's what it was called in a popular sense. That was definitely unfair, or at least perceived to be grossly unfair. And ultimately, because of the intransigence of the Prime Minister at the time, coupled with a couple of other things, that cost her job, and then ended up with Margaret Thatcher stepping down in November 1990. And that's what the key thing in that, which triggered it all really, was the council poll tax, because there was this perception, strong social perception, that it was unfair because people didn't have the ability to pay it. And despite everything else, property worth millions of pounds, they were still going to pay exactly the same council tax as somebody who owned a house that's only worth £5,000 type of thing. And it's not equitable, and there's a grossly different ability to pay. So that you need to be thinking about these, and there'll be something that as an official you've designed and you can't see that there's anything wrong with it, But when it sees the public light of day, then they work it out for you, and then you start to wince because you hadn't thought about it. That's why for any new innovations you want to do, you really do need to consult widely with a whole range of different interest groups. Because if you're going to be putting in a new tax, you can almost guarantee it, you're going to get criticized for it. So it's best to preempt that completely. Any questions on this with where we've got to so far on this?
Oui. J'ai une question.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Au niveau du slide 7, vous avez évoqué le concept de fardeau excédentaire. Voilà. Je pense, oui, c'est ça, fardeau excédentaire. Je pense que c'est au niveau du slide 7. Donc, est-ce que cela veut dire que le FMI, vous arrivez à déterminer pour chaque pays le niveau d'imposition auquel on tombe dans, où l'économie devient, je vais dire, improductive? Très bien. Voilà. Je vous en prie. Je disais que vous avez évoqué le concept de fardeau excédentaire. Cela m'amène à vous demander si le FMI arrive à déterminer pour chaque pays un seuil de niveau d'imposition auquel que le pays ne devrait pas dépasser, sinon il tomberait je vais dire, dans cette zone de fardeau excédentaire.
All we can do here is stylize this because it's really hard to work out what it's going to be in any given situation. And the guideline is simply you should try to minimize it. But I don't think there's any guidance on any trigger point in a particular level, because it will very much depend upon what you're trying to do. So I don't think I can really give you any help there on that. I can't think of anything offhand, although I'm sure there must be something I'm thinking about it, but I just don't know really. Because it's very difficult. It is really hard actually to work out what that dead weight loss is, the fardeau excédentaire is.
Merci beaucoup.
Yeah, so sorry, I can't help. I will write it down though. It's written down. You can see my scribble on my sheet. I've written it down. Okay. Anybody else? But thank you, Hubert, for that question. Anybody else? So now this is to do with the benefit principle. And basically, if you're benefiting from some government's expenditure, you should be the one who pays for it in the first place. Well, first question, is it equitable? Is it efficient? It can be very contentious, this, because clearly there are some things that we spend money on as a government, and we're raising tax to pay for it, where there's going to be a group of people who are not or ever going to benefit from it. I distinctly remember a big argument about somebody who said that a group of people actually, well, we're never going to have children. Why should we pay tax for the schools? Or we never get sick. Why should we pay for the hospitals? You know, there's a social contract here between the government and the people that some of these things are going to be paid for, regardless of the fact that some people may never benefit from them. But on the other hand, you know, roads and things, you know, and this depends on the country, but often it's a mix of fixed general charges through the tax system, tolls in some countries, but more often than not, it's the excise and other taxes that are applied to motor spirits, as they're called, that pay for it, which is generally fair. But on the other hand, if you're in a very rural area where there's not many people, and it's a local fuel tax, then you're probably not going to get the road paid for without the government intervening, saying, well, actually, this is a public good and we need to build it regardless if there's only 20 people in that area. They need the road, full stop. So there's a lot of issues in this, right? And that comes down to these concerns. You know, it is actually quite difficult for certain things to determine who's going to benefit from them. And the example they give in here is defense, incorrectly spelled, but never mind. But you know, certain sectors of society will be quite not happy about funding the military. If you don't get this calibrated correct, you may actually get it to people to discourage the use of public goods and services, which then gives weird allocation choices. On the toll roads, I know of people who would do anything they possibly could to avoid paying a toll, even driving 30, 40 kilometers out of their way just to avoid it. That's daft. They're actually spending more money doing that than they would paying the toll, right? But these are the sorts of odd behavioral issues you need to be thinking about when you're looking at designing a tax system. So the benefit principle is important, but you need to condition it because at times, although it holds true generally, at other times it is actually going to be unhelpful in terms of you thinking through the design. There's the ability to pay principle. I've already mentioned this, but there's this two ways of thinking about it. The vertical equity, so people who've got the greater capacity to pay should pay more. That's why we have progressive tax systems. But those who are at the same level, the same ability to pay, they should all pay the same. And I gave two examples, one on each of these before. But there are some little wrinkles. What do we define by the same? How do we consider wealth or income dependence? So there are many things that go into that. It can be challenging to have something that's perfectly equitable, both horizontally and vertically. And if you try to make it more equitable, the consequence may be that it becomes very, very complicated and reduce revenue. So, there are trade-offs here. So this comes back to this point about regressive taxes and progressive taxes. Income taxes generally are progressive. The more you earn, the more you pay. If it's proportional, by the way, when I say the more you earn, it's the rate of tax increases with the ability to pay. Because clearly, if you've got a proportionate tax, which is the black line, if they're just a fixed proportion of income rather than an increasing proportion of income, which is what you get with a progressive tax system, clearly somebody on a proportionate system, somebody who earns more is going to pay more than somebody who earns less. But the point about the progressive system is it's not just that, it's the actual rate of tax increases with income. So the total tax extracted is far, far greater than you'd have with a proportionate system. And then lastly, the regressive taxes, where the amount of tax you pay is based upon the price of the product in some way. So value-added tax is a regressive tax. But the thing is, you're paying the same for the same good as somebody, but as a proportion of your income, you're paying less. That's why that slope downward, because it's the y-axis is the percentage of income paid as tax. And that's why, just looking ahead a little bit with VAT, if you've got some exemptions or zero ratings, the people who benefit are not the people who you think are going to benefit. We'll talk about that a bit later. The Portuguese isn't quite lined up. I'll try and make sure we can line it up. So the left-hand side on the French and the English is the content of the slide in Portuguese, basically. Flexibility, and I touched on it, saying as things change, the tax should be able to cope with that. And this is what we're talking about. And you need to think about the buoyancy, right? So as the whole system's changed, and if we've changed some policies, when we'd be using the elasticity measure. But if we can't capture all of that, then we'd be using the buoyancy measure. This is what Karim was talking about on Wednesday, right? So that the buoyancy is summarizing the impact of both tax policy as well as the tax administration. Whereas the elasticity is adjusting for these changes. So one's doing things in a very clean way by adjusting for everything, and that's the elasticity, whereas the buoyancy isn't. And so as an example of this, this is on the right-hand side of the slide. I'm just going to move the Portuguese. It lines up now. Basically, what we get is that buoyancy generally isn't going to be different much from one, at the very least in the short run. But in the longer range, the interesting thing is it does tend to drift above one for about half of the OECD countries. And if we look at the different types of taxes, we can see how the buoyancy changes over time ranges. So in the graph here, what we're looking at here is for the different types of taxes. So from the left-hand tax, it's personal income tax, then social security taxes, corporate income tax, the goods and services tax, which is what VAT is, excise tax, and then lastly, property taxes. And we can see that for personal income tax, the long run is just under one, but the short run it's slightly more than one. Whereas social security taxes, it's the other way around. Corporate income tax is even more so in the short run than the long run. But you can see what happened there. GST, it's slightly higher in the long run than the short run, but there's not much in it. But excise taxes, they've got quite a big wedge there between the long and the short run. It's something like 14 points, all right? But nowhere near as big as that wedge for Social Security taxes. And then property taxes, short run, 0.05. That's a lot, right? Any questions on the slide? Any questions? Wrong one. What am I doing? All right, so just moving on a little bit, bearing in mind that the elasticities, buoyancies, this is to do with the automatic stabilizers. Remember when you in Kareem's lecture, we touched on this, and when you've got the automatic stabilizers, when GDP is growing strongly, the tax revenue will grow quite nicely with it. When GDP is slowing down, GDP growth rate slowing down, then tax incomes will fall automatically with that. So it's an automatic stabilizer. And if you don't have any Social Security type framework, then you will have an automatic stabilizer in terms of the taxation. We can see that, as it says from this research of 2009, that taxes on income have higher output gap elasticities, i.e. for changes in economic state, whereas taxes on goods and services have lower ones. And then taxes on capital gains and so on. That's a bit indeterminate in some ways. What do we want to do now? Oops. Yeah, so tax administration simplicity. You don't want to have to be paying an awful lot of money to collect your tax. The more efficient you can collect it, the more efficient your administration is, the better. Compliance costs, though, that's what's borne by the person paying the tax. They also should be kept low. And as it says in here, compliance costs are often larger than the administrative costs. And you can see a small firm being inundated with volumes of paperwork to fill in just to export something, right? And that is the point that's being made of Britain leaving the EU. The compliance costs have become incredibly expensive for many things. As it says down here, if you've got multiple regimes, many different rates, many ways of applying it, if you've got exemptions, if you've got a complicated tax administration, then all you're going to do is create an avoidance and an evasion environment. So you've got to think about this quite carefully. The simplicity is best, much better. Transparency. So in other words, one, you should be able to know what your money is going to spend on, but also you should be able to work out how much tax you've got to pay. I'm out of time. Hubert, you raised your hand. Hubert.
D'abord, je voulais savoir précisément ces deux questions. La première, c'est savoir, c'est quoi en fait les coûts d'observation? Parce que j'ai compris les coûts de civisme fiscal, mais je n'ai pas compris ça consistait en quoi les coûts d'observation. Non, la seconde question, c'est de qu'est-ce qui explique le fait que les administrations douanières sont plus coûteuses dans les pays à revenus élevés, ça fait 5% du PIB, alors qu'elles sont moins coûteuses dans les pays à faible revenu, ça fait 2,6% du PIB. Qu'est-ce qui explique cette différence-là?
I don't know. 2.6% of what? 2.6% of the goods and services brought across the border?
Oui, sur le graphique, c'est mis que dans les, pays à faible revenu, les administrations douanières, ça fait 2,6% du PIB. Alors que dans les pays à revenu élevé, ça fait 5,59%.
I thought it was 6.53, but anyway, yeah. So, if you've been following the departure of Britain from the European Union, you'll be aware that it's created a vast headache of paperwork and burden for people. And that's because of all the different bits these things are supposed to comply with as they go across the border and the checks that are imposed. And as time's gone on, there are more and more and more things to check for. That's why if you're within a customs union, you can get massive efficiencies because you don't need to fill in the paperwork, basically. There are some small firms in Britain that just don't export anymore, or at least don't export to the EU because it's too hard. There's a lot of cost in doing it. That's on the burden on the people. But just think about what they've had to do at the various port authorities and airports to hire hundreds and hundreds of people to do all the checks that they haven't had to do for 46 years. More than 48 years. It's not cheap to do this stuff. And given that they tend to look at a lot of different things, by means, it's not just checking the box that comes in. There's a whole lot of ancillary checks and tests that are done. It is not going to be cheap. You would not expect low-income countries to be testing for making compliance with I don't know, just think something, origin issues necessarily, where there's certain countries where they're not going to permit anything to go across the border. And the EU is probably the most burdensome one, and it's a problem. But in the old days, it was simply, what's the object? What's the excise rate? What's the cost of it? Here's the bill. Very simple, but it's not like that for many countries. Does that at least sketch around that question, Hubert?
Oui, tout à fait, je comprends. Je comprends, c'est-à-dire que les pays à revenus élevés ont des contrôles plus stricts et donc ça demande plus de moyens.
That they can do, yes. But consider within the customs union area in the EU, there are no checks within it. But getting in and out can be fraught with problems. Okay. Transparency. If you've got to pay tax, you should be able to work it out. You shouldn't have to really hire somebody to do it for you. That's typically what they end up doing in the United States. It should be very easy for you to work it out. It should be easy for you to check for compliance. It should be easy for you to do all sorts of things. The more transparent, the fewer problems you've got. Yeah.
I had raised my hand, but I think you missed me.
I can't see raised hands.
Oh.
Unless I've got one of the machines configured to see them, I can't, because I have to for me to see what's on my screen, I've got to minimize that thing so I don't see it.
Yes. I had a question regarding costs,
right?
Especially for low-income countries. As you are aware, low-income countries have relatively low tax to GDP ratios, and they are required by our development partners to try and increase those tax to GDP ratios by being innovative in tax and by increasing the tax bases. But in doing that, inevitably, we end up having high administrative costs and high compliance costs because some of the scopes are quite new. For example, the digital taxation, for example, reverse charge VATs on either determining goods, if it is a good or a supply. So I wanted to know, what recommendations would you give, especially low-income countries, in balancing these costs in administration and compliance with the challenge they have of trying to raise their tax to GDP ratios? Thank you.
So just putting to one side increasing the tax to GDP ratio to start with. Why? Why would you be asked to do that? For what purpose are you being asked to raise your tax to GDP ratio?
For what purpose?
Yeah.
Yes, we well, low income countries of course have a lot of obligations, debt obligations, which is now part to us accessing financing from the World Bank, from development partners. So that is also done as an assessment in order to get financing. If we collect less, we are at a high risk of default. So in us trying to get financing from our development partners or other types of financing, we have to try and increase our collections of tax. But this collection of tax, of course, goes into untapped areas. Administratively, it will require the enforcers to have training. It will require more manpower. In terms of compliance, the taxpayers have to deal with complex filing systems. And as you're aware, some of these things, we are putting them online. Some taxpayers have no access to internet. Some taxpayers are really not very computer literate. So it will be a cost on administration and a cost also on the taxpayer. So my question is, how do we harmonize? Because now we have to increase our tax base and also try and make sure that the cost of administration and compliance by the taxpayers who will eventually pay is low, so that we have more compliance. So that is the trade-off that we have. How can we harmonize that?
It comes back to my question. Why? So why have you got the debt? Putting aside the pandemic, What's the purpose of the debt?
The purpose of the debt, of course, is to try and plug some of the deficits that are not generated through the revenues. For example, infrastructure, some big infrastructure projects, dams, electricity, water, etc. Yes.
So building a road or a dam, and let's say it's a dam. The dam's going to be providing what? Water or water and power, right? Is that right?
Yes, yes.
So let's say it's a 1 gigawatt power station. The cost of construction of a hydropower project is approximately $1 per watt. Therefore, it's $1 billion for a gigawatt power station, very roughly. And it's got tangential benefits because you've got the water stored behind the dam wall, and that can be used for other things other than hydroelectricity generation. So I've built this 1 gigawatt power station, and assuming that the hydrography around it's well thought out and it can run continuously, it just goes flat out, 100% operational, 1 gigawatt. What's the revenue from that power station, roughly?
It would be a bit hard to estimate the revenues on that.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't.
Why do you think otherwise?
Because it's cost you $1 billion for the dam, right? And you are being charged a rate of interest on that dam. And let's assume it's concessional, right, that you're being charged. But if it wasn't concessional, what would be the market rate that you're charged, roughly? If it wasn't concessional funding, how much should it be charged for that funding?
If it is not concessional, it would go from about 4 to maybe 9%.
Right. So
yes.
9%. So you are being charged something like $90 million per annum for that dam. You've got some running costs, but this is going to be the big charge. What about the infrastructure to connect the dam to the electricity grid? What's the cost of that? Let's just assume, to make life simpler, that there was the grid running straight by it, and so the interconnect costs marginally approximately zero. You know, therefore, that you have to generate, putting aside the concessionality, because the concessionality is a concession, you have to have a real rate of return on that dam of at least $90 million a year. You therefore know already what you need to be charging for that base load power from that dam. It's got to be, right, $90 million per annum. The dam will generate, if it's going flat out all the time, which it won't, but never mind, just make life simpler, you're going to be generating 365 gigawatt days of power, right? Which is approximately 36.5 thousand gigawatt hours of power. You divide 90 million by 36.5 thousand gigawatt hours, and you'll come up with a sum that's approximately 0.3 cents per kilowatt hour for the power generation. That's your minimum charge for the power to cover the cost of the debt. If once you've added on the transmission charges and the other reticulation charges and things like that, if you are not able to cover the cost of that dam by the sales of the electricity, you should not be doing it because it's economically not viable. So what I'm getting to is that if you've put in some infrastructure, putting aside some social infrastructure that's necessary, these commercial type things, which an electricity plant is, the road is as well, and there are many others, if you're not costing them appropriately, then you will have to dig into the public purse. But if it's appropriately thought through, you will not be hitting the taxpayer. All the taxpayer has to do is guarantee the loan, but it shouldn't have to pay for it. Therefore, there should be no impact on the tax. Got it?
Yes.
That makes sense?
Yes, it does.
But
It
that's
does.
not what happened, is it?
No.
That's not what happens.
I'm glad you agree with that.
Right? But that doesn't happen because there's poor governance and poor thinking, and the officials haven't done their job. That's the problem. And it may also be a pet project for a minister. So there's political interference, poor governance. It's not, shouldn't be allowed, right? But yes, I do know that there'll be a tax impact, but there shouldn't be, right? Because if that dam's being built for the purpose that is articulated, the government will get the revenue that's needed to fully pay for all that, and it will be creating employment, businesses, and all sorts of other things that themselves will generate taxable flows. So in that case, you don't need to increase your tax or try and broaden the net. You need to think through the whole logic of it all, right? But I know that doesn't happen, right? I'm aware of that. But I'm trying to tell, what I'm trying to get across to you is you got to separate these things out and think about them clearly, simply, and then bring it together. And to do the power plant thing, it's just simple CAPM, cost of finance, to work out what the minimum hurdle rate is for that dam. And it should not be hitting the taxpayer. The taxpayer should just be there to guarantee it. But coming back to the question you were actually, I think, really asking, the thing is, this fairness and equitable thing, right? You can't raise tax for people who don't have any money to pay it, right? It doesn't make sense.
Yes.
So you have to create opportunities for those people to have higher value creation opportunities so that they create the revenues that can then be taxed, rather than actually increasing the rate of tax. It is possible to broaden the net of tax. I'm going to come to that later in the lecture. But the key point really, when you talk about the loan debt causing a tax increase, that shouldn't be happening if it's thought through properly. That's a contentious statement, I know that, and I'd love to have a 30-minute debate on it, but we don't have time for that. And I better get on with the lecture. But have I at least danced around the question? Because I think what you're really asking will come to later on in the lecture. It's a very good question, by the way. I quite like it.
Yes, you have.
Right.
Thank you.
But when we get to that part later on, and I think it's in part B, please pull me up again. And if you do have a question, shout out. If I haven't, to see the screens, I can't, I've got to minimize the little bar that shows you the hands going up so I don't see them.
Okay.
Sorry. So when I was doing it yesterday for Kareem, no, not yesterday, Wednesday for Kareem, I could see it because I was monitoring what he was doing, so I could see the hands going up. It's a problem, but never mind. Where am I? Transparency. I think I've covered this. So we're going on to recent trends, which means it's now 15 minutes since I was supposed to stop. We're going to take a 10-minute break. Take a 10-minute break. I wanted to stop 30 minutes ago when my timer went off. Okay. Steve or Anna, can you put us up a 10-minute break? Thank you. It was on top of my head. It was in the wrong place. Can you see it in the right place now? Is that better? Yeah. I forgot to swing it down. So where am I? Yeah. Right. So we can see that over time, tax to GDP has generally gone up as the wealth per capita has increased, and that we can see that that's broadly the case when you look at it in terms of purchasing power parity income per capita in dollars, international dollars. It says here there's a general drift up, and that sort of makes sense. All right, sort of. And part of the reason for this is the increasing demand in services. As people have got wealthier, they've demanded more services from the governments. And go back, Ian, go back. Or is it gone? Oh yeah. If you, it doesn't have it there. So if you look at that period, on the left-hand side of the well, for me, it's the left-hand side. In Portuguese, it's on the one that you're looking at, but for the French thing, it's the left-hand side graph. There's quite a distinction that period between 1900 and 1949 that's in that sort of middle block roundabout, the bulk of them around about sort of 10 to 15%. There's then this jump up generally after the Second World War, and then a modest shift up post 1980. And you can see that if you think about what was happening in that post Second World War period, there was a far greater shift to the government providing some core services, health and social security, than had been the case prior to that. And there's a further lift up again from the 1980s. And then if we look on the right-hand side of the graph for the English and French, but in this next one in the Portuguese, we can see that there's the tax rate per capita goes up quite clearly with income. This is not on a time basis, as you can see it by income level of the economy. Very clear, sharp distinctions, all right? That, I think, is more the question you were asking, wasn't it? You're being told to drive your tax revenue up, right? From down here to somewhere up here. And that's a developmental issue. Down at this part, the government actually hasn't got the capacity to raise the revenue needs to do many things. The economy's not developed enough. So part of the thing about increasing your taxes, which is the tax collection rate and things, that's a developmental exercise. It's a consequence of the development. It's not a precursor to it. It's definitely the thing that follows rather than the thing that starts. Hence my point about the dam, right? Borrowing to build the dam, the consequence of that is the power generated by that dam should be sold at an economic rate to the rest of the economy. so that the loan is covered, and indeed a modest profit ideally should be attributed to it. For a power plant, the normal cost of capital for commercial electricity generators of somewhere between 8 and 10% is the real cost of capital. You need to be able to have that, and so the return on equity is therefore around about 15%. You need to have a return on equity around about that. And if you're not getting it, the government, even though the government's not a commercial entity, the government's not being compensated for all the risks and everything that goes around that. So that's why 35, 40 years ago, in many advanced economies, they went through a phase of either privatizing certain activities, or putting them into state-owned enterprises that are then run on fully commercial lines, so that there's not this cross-subsidy occurring from the taxpayer to things which could otherwise actually be done by the private sector. But from a developing country's perspective, they are the agent. There's nobody else going to do it, really. So the government takes on the burden of borrowing the debt to build the infrastructure, but frequently and unfortunately, that infrastructure is not, the use of it is not appropriately charged for. Now, that's trying to loop back to your question in a slightly different way. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay, good. And please bring me back to your questions as we go through this, because there are things in here which I think can be usefully talked about. So we can see these trends in revenue in both low-income countries and upper middle income and high income countries over time, right? Now this time snapshot here is short term. It's only for the past 20 years. In fact, it's 12 years when that was taken, right? So if for each colored line, there may be a modest trend in some of them, like the taxes on goods and services is gradually rising. That is reflecting that more and more countries have taken on VAT type, goods and services taxes type taxes. As a consequence of that, for the other things have gone down slightly. But broadly speaking, you look at personal income tax, sort of flat, slightly down, corporate income tax, bounced around, but broadly, it's generally flattish, with some of those exceptions only there. That circled bit under the revenue trends in low-income countries on social security taxes, bouncing around. There's obviously some various things going on there, all right, for different countries for different reasons. And then a drop in goods and services taxes. That, by the way, if you look at it in that period, seems to be more connected with the financial crisis rather than anything else. On the right-hand side in the English and the French, but in this next slide in the Portuguese, you see how the various different tax types have shifted around and the composition of them. In Europe, there's the 7% around of GDP tax on value-added taxes. Social security taxes, that's to cover things like health and social welfare, 7.5% of GDP. And then personal income tax is taking about 3%, corporate about 2%, and a tiny bit on international trade. That international trade tax is the customs and excise. And if we leap backwards 250 40 years before now, the dominant tax would have been the excise, the trade tax, rather than anything else. There certainly weren't taxes on goods and services like we have today, and personal income and corporate taxes didn't quite work like that. They were not really there. So it was purely on customs and excise. And you see that in the United States, they didn't get personal income tax for a long time. The government, the federal government, relied on trade taxes, customs and excise. In the past 50 years, the progressivity of tax scales, and this is income taxes, right, is generally fallen. And there are a number of reasons for that. You see the peak in the blue line on the left there. It's in the late 1970s or thereabouts. And that peak is at about the time that many advanced countries started to really get their teeth into adopting goods and services, value-added taxes, point one. The second point is that sometime from round about 75, it became more and more clear that having the very high income taxes that some countries had was actually completely, totally and utterly unproductive. And in part that was inspired by people like Laffer, who pointed out that I'll try and draw this. So if you've got, I'll try to do this. I'm going to do this on the French slide first. So you got that, right? So if you've got a scale here, that's your tax rate, and on the vertical axis here, the tax you're getting, there's a peak somewhere, and I could try and do this on the English one. So the French and the Portuguese should be able to have seen that one. Change the color to not very good at that. So this is along the x-axis here is tax rate, and then on the y-axis is the amount of tax collected. So if you're up here somewhere, right, and you cut taxes, your actual tax revenue earned goes up, and then it slides down again. So these peaks here in the advanced countries generally coincided with an increased adoption of value-added taxes and indirect tax, and the recognition that they were sitting somewhere up here on the Laffer curve, so that they knew they could actually cut taxes and get more revenue, which is what they did. And that seems to have been adopted in emerging markets as well. All right. Because as you cut the tax here, obviously the progressivity decreases, but you're making up for it, one, because your revenue's gone up anyway, and two, you've got these indirect taxes. Now the thing about that is that if you look at the total tax take, though, it will have gone up. Now, there's another reason for decreasing progressivity, and that's starts in around about the year 2000 in some countries. maybe a little bit earlier, where they start to have concepts of family incomes needing to be at a particular level, and using the tax system to ensure that families who are actually working are getting a tax credit given back to them. And there's all sorts of names for that type of system. But basically, it means that in some countries, a family of 2 adults and 2 or 3 children don't pay any income tax, provided their incomes are roundabout slightly above the median income for the country. But then above that, there's a gradual increase in tax. But the underlying tax brackets are still as they were, with a modest degree of progressivity. But by using these reverse tax credits, it flattens the whole lot out. Hence, you see what you're seeing here. And on the right-hand graph here, you can see that, that there's definitely this line here indicating that where people are not too keen to be on the top side of it, and they all tend to be bunched down in here. I am, this is anecdote, which may or may not be helpful. In 1967, the United Kingdom had significant balance of payments problems. They devalued the pound, and they increased the top rates of income tax. My father was paying before that £19.06 on his top, basically £1 on his top income. He was earning about £1,000 a year. When they brought the tax in, the new one, for every pound he earned of about £800, he paid £1.06 tax. So he was actually paying more tax than he was earning. It was called a disincentive to earn, which he did. He had to rearrange his tax affairs, which is not really what he should have done, I think, but never mind. So you can get some very perverse incentives if you don't think properly what you're doing in terms of your tax rates, the marginal rate, the trade-off between personal and corporate income taxes. It's all quite tricky. By the way, any questions on this, please shout out if you want to ask a question. And this is thinking back to what I said, sort of, about incentives. These incentives, by the way, that they're talking about here are not what I was talking about. They're talking about corporate tax incentives to try and attract investment. Now, these things, before there was the research, I was a critic of this because I thought it was a somewhat stupid idea, because the corporates you're attracting are not really the people you should be attracting, point one. Secondly, they've got greater capacity to avoid tax, and the government have got lawyers to work out how to impose the tax. And that's clearly what you're observing, and the papers generally support that. But that was, of course, my heuristics on it rather than having done the research. But there's certainly what you see. People get attracted into a country and they'll stay there until there's another opportunity that's even more attractive to them. For some countries, though, that's not quite the case. The Republic of Ireland, the Free State, has been quite successful in this. But that's because they've got some other advantages running for them. They've got a very stable political environment. They've got excellent rule of law. They've got a common law jurisdiction that's got a long history of precedence, and because it's common law, they can pick up the best practice from other common law jurisdictions. And given that London's not that far away, they can certainly pick it up from there. And they are fully integrated into the European Union. So they have got quite a nice niche to exploit. But other countries don't necessarily have those types of advantages. And so the government's been taken for a ride in some ways. And that's what that's basically telling you. And if you're giving people tax holidays, you've got to be quite clear about what the purpose is and whether you really are prepared to be subsidizing an international corporate who can actually afford to pay their own way in any case. Right, policy issues and major tax revenue sources. So what we're going to quickly go through these. I want to skim through them because in some ways or other we've already talked about them briefly anyway already, and we need to get a move on. Yep.
Oui, donc, si j'ai bien compris la présentation, c'est que votre conclusion, c'est que les exonérations fiscales pour inciter les entreprises à investir, vous les déconseillez, c'est ça?
The funds research generally suggests that there's little benefit from them. That's what the funds research suggests. The funds research, I'll just go back to that slide in French. Is it gone? Where's it gone? Yeah, slide 19. The funds research generally suggests that they don't have any sizable effects on investment in the long term. They don't stimulate investment, and they don't tend to give the benefits that they frequently tout. And that there are more important factors for investment. That's in the English slide. In the pink, and in the French slide, it's just not without a box, but basically you're far better to have a simple, transparent, predictable tax system. All right. Okay, but look at those papers. I strongly suggest you look at those papers. They're somewhat older now, but the research is definitely saying that they can be helpful, but you've got to be really careful about the design, and that you've got to check on what other things you have. And I am well aware that some countries have done a really good job of making use of them to facilitate investment and facilitate economic development. But generally, they seem to be the exception rather than the rule. Yeah. Where am I? All right. Yeah. So we've got two broad flavors of tax. Was I told not to say flavors? I can't remember. Anyway, direct taxes and indirect taxes. So this is direct taxes. You're taxing on the flow of income. All right. So corporate income tax, personal income tax, payroll taxes. I think of them as social insurance taxes rather than payroll taxes, and property taxes. And then your indirect taxes, these such things as excises, taxes on international trade, royalties, taxing natural resources in some way or another, and then your value-added tax, retail sales tax, and so on. That's what we're going to quickly look at. These are your primary sources of fiscal income. And although there's been changes in structures, especially in income taxes, the thing about income tax is you've got a reasonably firm handle on it. It's very difficult for most people to evade paying income tax. If you look in the slides, Hubert, the references in the slides, if you've not downloaded the slides, I strongly urge you to download the slides. VAT has its beginnings in its current form anyway, in the European common market as it was, and it's spread right around the world. Basically, there are very few countries that don't adopt it. A notable exception being that large country south of Canada. Customs have been reduced in part because of VAT, but in part because of various free trade agreements and that sort of thing. And because the world's become more integrated, and especially when we've been trying to declutter the logistics lines, having a cleaner or minimalist or non-existent tax on the logistic chains to move things around has been incredibly important. You know, a piece of an electronic equipment, Southeast Asia, they do all sorts of things there, and a piece of componentry can be moved to countries 10, 20, 30 times in its production chain before it pops out as a phone or a calculator or whatever that's being produced. And that's because they're making use of the local resources that's optimum for producing one part of the equipment. If you've got taxes involved, it's going to mess that up. There are some nice case studies out of ASEAN on this type of thing. I don't know whether we reference them. If I can find some, I might drop those in, but it's quite instructive actually. So direct taxes. Skip across this. So just putting aside the state-owned enterprises, you've got this trade-off between corporate income tax and personal income tax because there's some disincentives, all right? And it mentions these in the slides here. If you've got a high corporate income tax, basically you're going to try and bend your cash flows so that you're minimizing your tax you're going to pay. But another way to avoid corporate income tax is to use transfer pricing. And if you've got a company that's extracting oil, for example, and to avoid paying the royalties, to avoid paying the taxes, all they have to do is either sell the oil that's extracted to a subsidiary outside the country at a very low transfer cost, or claim that the subsidiary is the actual extraction company, but they're not resident in that tax domicile, and therefore they don't pay tax. This is why, in part, some of those tax investments, tax incentives we're talking about on the other slides don't work, because the entities will do everything they possibly can to avoid paying any tax at all. I'll give you a very simple illustration of this. The banks in New Zealand, the dominant 4 banks, are all owned by Australian parents. They paid very little tax at one point, and Inland Revenue investigated what was happening. And what was effectively happening was that the parents were giving them a massive loan to cover things and charging a usurious amount of interest on it. That interest was completely tax deductible in New Zealand, and therefore the New Zealand entities were not paying any tax, basically. Well, when that was all sorted out, each of the banks had to give to Inland Revenue well over $1 billion New Zealand dollars each in tax that should have been paid. Now, because it all got very embarrassing and messy, it never actually went to court, and the banks claimed that they never had to pay it. But the fact that they did pay more than $1 billion of each to New Zealand Inland Revenue when they're being caught out for doing somewhat dubious tax avoidance demonstrates that they certainly knew that they were guilty as charged. And that's sort of what that transfer pricing block's talking about, which is, is it on here? It's not quite right on the French. So yeah, I've got the right slide there for that in French. Okay, anything on CIT before I move on? So some general guidance here. Make sure that you've got a single rate that's going to be able to efficiently allocate capital. Make sure that there's no egregious differences between the top marginal personal income tax rate and the corporate tax rate. Ideally, to really prevent it, you make the corporate tax rate higher, but that won't fly. You minimize your expenditure in general and limit any incentives. Avoid incentives and make everything as simple as possible to avoid complicated exceptions and exclusions and ways of avoiding tax. If you look at many countries' tax legislation, if you go back a long period in time, even just 60 years, they're generally quite thin statutes. But today, in some countries, the tax statutes are 1,000 or more pages long. That's way too complicated. It's because people have put in all sorts of exemptions and exceptions and rules in there. And the more rules you have, the easier it is to game it. And if it's easy to game, you can guarantee that companies will not be paying what they should be paying. What's I looking for here? If I got the right one here, I'm just trying to check I've got the right slide in the Portuguese. Oh yeah, that's it, I think here. So for personal income tax, in advanced countries, they tend to go to maybe 2 or 3 tax points rather than the multiplicity of them they used to have. It simplifies things. It does impact the progressivity to a degree, but it does make it a lot simpler. And it avoids some of it gets around some of the avoidance issues that people create when there's a lot of steps. If you've got small businesses that tend to be individually owned, they've got all sorts of ways to avoid things. They are difficult to tax, but you then have to be careful how you put in place any presumptive tax regimes. You're running a pizza business. We know that you're selling 20 pizzas a day, therefore you're going to pay us $500 tax. That sort of thing is not really healthy. If you've got a very high personal income tax rate, you can almost guarantee that high income individuals are going to avoid it in some way. And this thing about global personal income taxes, it's very difficult, but clearly there's a big drive to harmonize things an awful lot. And then that tax agreement last year demonstrates there's a concerted effort, especially amongst OECD countries, to try and resolve some of these issues. So we've touched on all of these: fewer brackets, withholding taxes. Yeah, I think I've covered that already. Oh, where'd that come from? Oh, yeah. So payroll taxes. These are targeted taxes to pay for health, pay for old age pensions, pay for Social Security typically. By putting them on the wages, that's really easy to be done that way. you can even have it such that both the employer and the employee pay proportionately into it. That may not always be applied, but it can be. But it is difficult to tax individual entrepreneurs, sort of thing. And it can be a discouragement. I don't know the answer to that, Hubert. I really don't know. Sorry. Yeah, it's hard to tax small businesses. And if you've got a high payroll tax rate, that's actually a disincentive to employ people. So there's a trade-off there, and you've got to be cognizant of it. And if you make it too complicated, that's also a disincentive for people to employ people. And because there's this interaction between the personal income tax and the social insurance type taxes, you've got to be really careful about the design of the progressive tax scales. And historically, in some countries, there's been a tax wedge created when the people hit at the top tax rate, they're not paying the social insurance tax. And that causes problems as well. So you've got to be careful about the design of them. In terms of property taxes, these, not always, but often are run by local authorities, councils. Historically, they were a way of taxing for governments, but they've generally been for local authorities. They can be very efficient, and they can be fair, but there are some issues at times. But basically, unless you keep an up-to-date property register where there's reasonably frequent valuations of the properties, the tax system can become somewhat biased and inefficient. So it's useful if you're taxing property to have some general valuation mechanism which keeps things up to date. It can be challenging to do that, but it solves a lot of problems. By valuation, I mean that the local authority is made aware of the value of the property, and that's then reassessed periodically every 2 years or 3 years or something. But it can be challenging to do that. I'm just going to go quickly to consumption taxes. So we can see here that value-added taxes are spread around the world. There's very, very few countries which don't have it, all right? And it's very flexible. It can be used in all sorts of ways. Issues tend to be that there are exceptions and zero ratings and things, and that causes all sorts of problems. You should ideally have one single VAT rate. 10%, 15%, whatever. Once you hit about 20%, it starts to cause problems. But certainly below 20%, a single rate, say 10%, 15%, 12.5%, very, very effective. But many VAT systems are undermined by having exemptions, zero ratings, and things like that. And the problem with the exemptions is, from a perspective of somebody who's on low income, they'd be arguing, well, we shouldn't have VAT on food, we shouldn't be having it on core things, core staple type things. And there's an argument for that. But the problem is that if you do put the exemption in, so zero rate food, for example, the people who benefit from it most are not the poor. It's the people who spend a lot on food who are the wealthy. They're the ones who actually benefit. It's far better to have a single rate that's on absolutely everything. It's a lot easier to administer it, and then use the social security or the tax transfer system to redirect the money to the people who actually need the support. Yeah, we could talk about that for hours, but I'm not going to. Is that the one I want? No. Yeah, so excise taxes. Yep.
Mais par rapport à ce que vous venez de dire sur la TVA, que sur les exonérations de TVA sur certains produits essentiels. Et le problème dans les pays comme les nôtres, c'est-à-dire ce que vous recommandez, c'est que plutôt que de faire une exonération sur les produits essentiels, le mieux c'est de laisser un taux général et après cibler les ménages les plus défavorisés et leur faire des transferts, c'est ça? Non, le problème chez nous, très souvent, c'est la difficulté de mettre en place un véritable programme vraiment ciblé pour identifier les ménages les plus pauvres et qui ont réellement besoin de ces transferts. C'est ça, cette difficulté que nos gouvernants sont confrontés et préfèrent alors faire le choix d'un taux de TVA réduit sur certains produits.
I know, but right, it's an opportunity. I'm not permitted to do TA on this, right? Because we're just training. But for example, consider this. Say you've got a system at the moment where food is 0 rated. And for a typical developing country basket of consumption, food is approximately 40% of that basket. Therefore, 40% of the items that could be eligible to have VAT attached to them are not actually going to have VAT paid. So let's pretend your current VAT rate's 15%. If you were to cut it to 10% and impose it on absolutely everything, but then at the same time say that anybody who has got a tax code, who it's clear needs assistance, will get a transfer payment, and you have to have a bank account for this as well. And you encourage the banks, and if you've got a state-owned bank, you direct the state-owned bank to ensure that everybody can have a savings account. And you tell people who have not previously had a tax code and not previously had a bank account that they will be given, I don't know, a present like $10 or something for signing up. You then get around the problem. Use a carrot and a stick approach. If you don't get yourself a tax code and you don't get yourself a bank account, you will not get the transfer payment, but you will still be paying 10% VAT, whereas at the moment you're not going to pay VAT at all. Just think of the revenue that will flood in and your ability to actually really target and support the people who've not been able to be supported before. You can actually target them far better, you can support them far better, and at the same time the people who can more than afford to pay it, people earning more than about 60% of the median wage, they will be starting to pay it. And that's just an outline thought, Hubert. That's not policy advice. I'll be clear about that. Does that help? Let Hubert come back, please.
C'est compris, c'est un axe de réflexion. Il y a certaines difficultés comme chez nous, le manque de couverture territoriale par les banques, tout ça. Mais bon, je pense que quand même, je pense que c'est ça l'idée. Je pense que c'est ça l'idée.
You got these? These are almost ubiquitous. You actually don't need a bank. You can do it in different ways. What I gave you was the outline thought. I didn't give you the policy advice, right? This is actually, from my perspective, a trivial problem to solve. But that's me, all right? But I'm not allowed to give policy advice, so I won't. But I just want to drop some thoughts into your minds to start thinking about how to exploit that opportunity. It's just a thought, all right? Now, who was it who came back? Who was it? It wasn't Hubert. Who was it?
It was me.
Oh, it's you, Abu. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to just pick your mind on this cross-cutting VAT, especially on the essentials. Now, when we have that, for example, in the VAT chain, people will be requesting for refunds. Now, the more people you have in the VAT register, in the VAT chain, it will make it very expensive for people to get refunds. And governments,
Why?
Why? One is that when some governments collect, they get that VAT and they put it in the consolidated fund, and they apportion money for refunds. For example, every 3 months, they say we shall apportion $3 million for refunds. Now, the more people you have on the register, it will become very expensive for government to keep refunding. That is why people have issues.
So the thing is, this comes down with I think this is the next block, part B, which we're running out of time to talk about, thinking about it. But can you pick me up on that in part B somewhere, right?
Okay.
You're not wrong, but it comes back to design and thinking and adopting as much as possible the use of contemporary technology to avoid all the bottlenecks and the issues of that. There are straight-through processing mechanisms to do this, where basically you can also verify and check before paying it. But the thing is, the broader you make that base, the more revenue you're going to raise. But I'll try and touch on it later. I am running out of time. I'm going to have to skip to part B, otherwise we'll not get into this at all. But you've got the notes. You just have to maybe read a bit more, because otherwise it will not get through this at all. It's a very, very long lecture, and I've tried to be parsimonious with things, but I've failed miserably. Apologies, everybody, for that. Revenue mobilization. So, right. So you got, this is an aim, all right? And there's a lot of work to be done in this space. But one advantage you've got is that you're doing this now, not 50 years ago or 60 or 70 years ago. And you don't need to go through the processes that these putatively advanced economies went through to get to where they are today. And the stunning example of this, in a different sense, not on this, mind you, is Kenya, with the development of all the mobile payments and the financing that can be done through the cell phones, the mobile phones, and the cell phone infrastructure that's around that to support it. There's all sorts of audit points you can put into supply chains and through that, which then enables you to have a much broader, auditable, checkable, in other words, tax base that you can plumb into. So we've got these UN goals. So how do we do that, making use of the technology that we've got now, which basically means that anything can be checked. If it moves, if it's electronic, you can grab it. There may be some challenges, but it's relatively straightforward. So this thing here, hard to tax sectors, the informality, right? And there are ways of managing this when it becomes more electronic. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons why it's attractive to consider the adoption of a central bank digital currency. Because if you're not using notes and coins, you're using central bank digital currency, you can track the lot. That's how it works, right? But we're not talking about that today. Many countries have got the weakness in the tax administration. And yeah, a lot of it is on still even today, paper files, people moving paper from one place to the other, people filling in forms. Now, there are reasons for that, right? I'm well aware of this. There are literacy issues, right? And they are challenging. But even what many would consider to be illiterate people can use these darn things, right? So it's not that challenging. You just got to think about how to do it differently. There are these multinational enterprises. They can cause you challenges, especially if you're relying on them for tax revenue. But that's just something you need to get your minds around. But don't forget, although it's a challenge for the lesser developed economies, it's actually a bigger challenge for the advanced economies. There's been a huge amount of work to try and tax these multinational enterprises. That's why there's been massive concerted effort in the last 10 to 15 years on this. Hence, the OECD's Financial Action Task Force's blacklist and grey list environments to try and coerce countries and corporate entities to behave themselves. The point you were raising about the non-banked, it's an important point. It should not be dismissed. But rather than say we don't have enough people banked and we're having difficulties getting them banked, you have to think creatively to use the contemporary technology so that they can be banked. And there are many ways of doing this. And it doesn't have to be necessarily the formal commercial bank framework. There are many other ways of doing this. But you need to have the capacity to explore thoughts for each country's context, because they're all different. But don't get yourselves walled in by what used to be done. The contemporary technology frees up things an awful lot. Trade liberalization, all right? So tax competition, that's actually being addressed for you by other countries, right? That's effectively what they agreed. Was it late last year or early this year? There's a general 15% international corporation tax framework coming in. International services not being able to be incepted at the border, that's basically been addressed now, at least to many countries. I know if I'm buying not books because they're VAT exempt in here. What did I do? I bought a whole load of rectifier diodes 2 months back. The VAT that was to be imposed here, that was paid at source to the firm that was sending it to me. There's the interconnects already in place to cope with that, but that's a coordination issue. It's not that challenging as long as you're coordinated. There are now multinational, supranational agreements that cover this stuff. These challenges are disappearing. Some things about Africa. So Africa is unbelievably rich in natural resource wealth. It's phenomenal, right? And there are problems with that being used as an income source and its impact on non-resource tax administration. For those of you who've done the Macroeconomic Management of Resource-Rich Countries course, the MRC course, you know you've been taught about things to avoid. But just in brief, if you've got a resource that's being mined, extracted, and you've got the multinational extracting it for you, yes, you're going to want to tax it, but do not use that tax revenue to support your general expenditure. That should be just shunted into a savings pool. Because basically, when you're extracting a mineral resource of some form, all you're doing, in truth, is converting it from a commodity resource in the ground to a financial resource that can be invested. But if you spend it, it's gone. I know it's painful to do this, but if you save it and then live off the investment income, in the long term, you're far better off. And yes, there are some immediate development needs, but with some careful thought, that can all be balanced out. But it's really important not to be reliant on the revenue stream from the commodities, because they're volatile and odd things happen. And in truth, you may not really be getting the revenue you should be. This geography part, the bulk of continental Africa, long borders, difficult to police, leak like a sieve. I know, right? Here in Mauritius, it's a bit more challenging. We've got thousands of kilometers of sea between here and most other places. Much easier to defend the borders. When you've got regional integration, some of that does have customs coordination, right? That's got some both challenges and opportunities. Those countries that are post-conflict, there's a massive rebuild required in all sorts of ways. And as it says here, the tax administration. And then last but not least, make use of contemporary technology to improve, because you can. It's relatively straightforward, and it's an awful lot cheaper than it was when advanced countries did this 60 odd years ago. You've actually got plenty of opportunities to improve this and make it far more effective than it ever was before. So some of simple measures, tax to GDP ratios, we've already touched on that, right? And there's this tipping point that's in that IMF paper from 2016. It's around about 12.75% of GDP. And as it says here, in just over half of low-income countries, the tax to GDP ratio does not exceed 15%, right? This so-called, hang on, come here, tax capacity. What can you actually best extract optimally based upon the underlying capacity? Tax effort, that's this ratio of collection in terms of GDP to the tax capacity. So it's the ratio of share of collections in GDP to tax capacity. These are important metrics. Where I want to go to, I need to get to, I'm just trying to find the right slide for the Portuguese. I'm going to be too challenged to do it, sorry. So here's the tax efforts in different countries, all right? Sorry on the Portuguese one, but have a look at the French slides. You should be able to work it out. In Europe, it's 77%. High-income countries generally 76%. In Africa, it's 71%. So it's not too bad. But by income group, 65%, 76%. It's not as bad as it used to be. And this is a 2013 report. For Africa to be at 71% tax effort, when you've got countries in South Asia Pacific being barely 60%, you know you're doing a reasonably good job, actually. So that means there have been some improvements, significant improvements, since the latter part of the 1990s. Tax gap, where's the tax gap one? Oh yeah, that's the one I want. Oh, go back. Can't get the mouse across. Yeah, so the tax gap is this gap between what you actually collect and what you think you should get if you had 100% compliance. And there are two parts to this. There's both the compliance gap, which is people avoiding it, and there's the policy gap in the sense that the potential and the actual collection framework. And so the combination of those two give you total tax gap. And in emerging economies, the compliance gap's the primary issue here. And there's been a huge amount of help given to countries in sub-Saharan Africa to improve that, to reduce the compliance gap. So since I've been here with ATI, we've had several tax advisors. Interestingly enough, over in Afritac West, I think there are more tax compliance people than anything else, and they've got the wrong Afritac. But the fund's composition of its advisors in the region reflects the focus, and compliance is certainly a particular problem. So you can use this to help identify risks. The bigger the gap, the greater the scope to improve revenue mobilization. And by looking at which of the gaps, whether it's a policy gap or a compliance gap, is guiding you as to where you need to be looking. And if you've got a compliance gap, that generally tends you to look at how are you collecting it, where are the loopholes, and where are the leaks. The compliance gap is going to be focused around leaks, and that's what you need to focus on. Quick, simple example. In Laos, for motor registration tax, that was collected by the provincial governments, and they didn't get very much revenue. The provincial governments were supposed to send it to central government. About 3 or 4 years ago, they changed it so it was a common collection, I think through the post offices, thinking about it, going straight to the central government. In just 6 weeks, by switching who was collecting it, they actually, in that first 6 weeks, they exceeded the entire previous year's car registration revenue. The leak was that the provincial governments weren't passing it on, and they were spending it on themselves. That's another government, it's a subsidiary layer of government doing that. Simple shifts in how the collection's occurring can plug a lot of gaps. Oh no, sorry. There's some interesting curves there to show you about tax gaps. And this is out of date now. It needs to be updated. But yeah, according to this, Uganda's not doing very well. Where am I? What time am I supposed to stop? At about now, I think.
Yes. Hi.
Yeah. Yeah, let's see what I can do. Basically, you need to improve. You need to, it's like with constant effort in terms of reforming your expenditures. You can't just put in place a tax administration system and expect it to just fly. You've got to constantly review what's happening, what are people's behaviors, and look for where your leakage points are, and why you've got them. And the broader and the more consistent you can apply the administration of the revenue collection, the fewer problems you've got, and the greater your actual revenue is going to be. And in fact, and I'm making this one up, if you've got a very leaky system and you plug all the gaps, you'll find you can actually cut the tax. Simple changes can make huge differences to how much tax revenue you receive. So here's some things to consider. I'm just going to go down the right-hand column here. The first change to make is to look at where are we most likely to have a risk of a leakage. Because if you do this on a risk-driven basis rather than a process-driven one, you can then focus on where you know the weaknesses are. And measuring overall income versus what you're expecting, this is measuring results, that also guides you. And you don't need to check absolutely everything. There will be differences between different entities, but a well-incentivized administration officer will be able to work out where you should be looking. The businesses that are taxed, they'll avoid that. It's in their interest to avoid paying it right. So they need to be educated by pushing down the responsibility down the tree in terms of the revenue administration, so that those who are actually doing the collection and doing the review and checking for problems are actually given full ownership of the problem. They are then automatically incentivized to look for problems and fix them, rather than having a top-down approach. You need to be far more collegiate and working together to get superior outcomes. And by doing that, everybody's incentivized to always be on the lookout on how to improve and how to adapt. And by doing that, it's really easy for the whole system to change on how it works as things move. Whereas in this more process-driven way, all you're doing is making a very arthritic system that will fail ultimately. So these are some of the key principles of successful reform. You make things voluntary compliance, but you have quite clear checks on a risk-based framework. And you focus the resources you've got to where the risks are. Simple example. If you're a typical inland revenue doing this, you've got a finite resource of people and budget to follow this through. A long time ago now, was the, analyst for a company when I was working for a stockbroking firm, an investment banking firm. The company I was analyzing was one of the very large companies in New Zealand. Their budget for tax advice, both in accounting and legal tax advice, was something like 20 times the entire inland revenues budget. When you're faced with an adversary like that, there's no way you can win. So you have to think in a completely different way. And you have to simplify the entire legal framework and the regulations, because otherwise somebody who's armed with tax lawyers will find every single loophole they can. Keep it simple. Keep it very simple. I think, now, Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, when they revitalized, reviewed, changed the Russian tax system 30 years ago, they basically brought it down to a common tax level of 10%. Compliance was easy, made it a lot easier, and revenues came through the roof. It was a big change from what it had been. But I don't know how it is now. But is what I've just said vaguely correct, Anna?
Yeah, you are correct. There was a sort of simplification of tax system reform, indeed, and that helped a great deal to combat informality. You know.
Yeah, because the tax revenues went through the roof. They were greatly surprised.
Well, before that, the tax was very complex, and the tax rate was too high, perhaps, and people prefer not to pay taxes. It was, in other words, to pay it. Well, what I was going to say, the decision between to pay taxes versus not to pay taxes depends on, the taxpayers weigh the cost of paying taxes versus the benefits of paying taxes. And if the cost overweight the benefits that they don't pay. So that's
sounds like a friend of mine who used to live in Hong Kong. He went into his accountant in his first year there, and they were saying about paying tax. And the accountant said to him, "Well, how much do you want to pay?" And my friend said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, if you only want to pay this much, I'll make sure that's all you pay. And I'll charge you double that to make sure that's all you pay." It's wouldn't run it that way. These are the key characteristics that you need to have in a revenue administration system, right? Basic organization, clear strategic management, transparency, you've got critical functions, and you've got a human resource function that ties everything together. But crucially, it's the last one on the list, having the IT systems to be able to monitor and do things in a very flexible way. It's that whole lot, when you tie it together properly, can be incredibly powerful. So when in the standard framework, you try to make sure that you're pushing deterrence, but it doesn't work properly. You need to fundamentally rethink the way you're running your tax revenue administration. You need to refocus to looking at on a risk-based approach and broaden everything out, make it simple to comply, make it painful to not comply, and get rid of all sorts of rules and regulations that are just being used as a minefield for people to get stuck in terms of the administrators, because the lawyers that you're trying to defeat can know how to work that minefield to great effect. And I will shut up. I overran by 15 minutes. No.
Thank you very much, Ian. Yes, that was a very long presentation for you. So thank you.
I'm now going to go to sleep.
No, not yet, not quite yet.
So if we take a 15-minute break.
Yes, everybody deserves now a break. Yes, 15 minutes break. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we'll come back and we'll go into doing the workshop.
I do hope.
I do hope everybody read the notes so that you know exactly what we're doing. So it only takes 20 minutes. And was it surely les poules auront des dents? There you go, Olivier. That's for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So Anna or Steve, can we have a 15-minute timer, please?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, we're back. You know, Ian, while you